So first, this video will not make sense unless you've seen this one, Erasing My Awful Book from the History of the Internet. Seriously, go watch that one first before watching this. Also, don't watch this. So, you know when you make a promise, but the preconditions of that promise seem so extraordinary, you don't really ever expect the bill to come due? I guess that's what was going through my mind when I promised to read a copy of this awful book on a live stream if I ever reached 500,000 subscribers. Because after all, at the time, 100,000 subscribers seemed like a naive pipe dream. But the internet has a way of coming back to bite you, and a promise is a promise, so here we are. And I'm doing you all one better. I decided to create a fully produced audiobook of Fallen Angels #1, Welcome to Munich. This isn't going to be good. You're not going to like this. You think you want this, but you don't. You'll see. Alright, enough beating around the bush. Let's get to it. Seriously, last chance. Don't say I didn't warn you. Fallen Angels, Book 1, Welcome to Munich. Based on the television pilot by Tempest Pictures. Dedications. To Al, Kat, Vinny, and Lance. Thanks for the hard work. Chapter 1. Here we go. Charlie Wade stepped forward to enter the small conference room. Inside was a chair waiting for him, placed dead center a few yards away from a long table where 6 well-dressed parole board members were looking him over intently. Wade walked over to the chair as calmly as possible and took a seat. The chains attached to his handcuffs knocked against one another as he sat, making a loud and obnoxious chinging sound that he had become far too accustomed to. He lifted his left hand to draw his hair behind his face, looking at the group of people before him. One of the men opened up a file folder and turned on a camera. "Please state your name for the record," he said bluntly. "Charlie Wade?" Wade cleared his throat and straightened himself up. He needed to look as dignified as possible. "Thank you," a woman responded. She opened her folder as well and looked up at him. "Mr. Wade, the purpose of this hearing is to determine whether or not you meet the proper qualifications for early release," she stated. "While your conviction was meant to last until age 21, you've shown remarkable improvement on both your part and the part of your fellow inmates." Wade remained silent. She continued. "You have been suggested by senior staff members, ward supervisors, as well as in-house occupants to be placed on the short list as a nominee for early release on good behavior." "I understand," Wade responded. Another man from the board leaned in towards Wade. "Mr. Wade, what we're trying to find out today is, if given the opportunity to be released back into society, what guarantee is there that you won't fall back into a life of crime?" "Take your time," Wade thought. "Give them an answer that works. My family is no longer here. I've been making smart decisions in this place. I'm an adult now," Wade said clearly. "I can live on my own." "Perhaps," the man interrupted, "but several of my colleagues and I are not fully convinced. The outburst of emotion you displayed that initially got you in this whole mess was started because you refused to get help." "I would have thought the reason it started was because of my father," Wade interjected. "The reason I'm talking about, the reason you're in here, is because of you and the choice you made," the man said sternly. "Idiot," Wade told himself. "Quit arguing with him or you'll never get out of here." "I know where to go if I need help," Wade said aloud. The man craned his neck to the side. "If that were true, then why didn't you seek help before your first offense?" Wade thought for a moment, staring down at his hands glued together restlessly on top of his lap. He peered down himself and looked at the bright orange jumpsuit he was wearing, thoughts racing through his head. "My home life was cruel. My school life was worse. I had nothing. I was miserable. I fell into a self-destructive pattern where nothing mattered to me, and I didn't care about anything or anybody. And living in that sort of situation. Once again, Mr. Wade, we're here to discuss you, not to hear you blame your actions on everything under the sun." "I'm not blaming my actions on anything, or anyone, for that matter," Wade cut in. He was tired of getting interrupted. This was his chance, his turn to speak. "I blame me," Wade said, looking at the man, "just as much as you do. I had the choice as to whether or not I was going to be in here, and I made the wrong choice. I have another choice now, an opportunity to make a better choice. I've got a chance to start over. And I promise you, and I promise myself, I won't make the wrong choice again." Glances darted between the board members for several moments. Finally, a woman spoke. "Mr. Wade, what do you think you would do if released?" Wade looked at each one of the board members, making eye contact with every one of them. He then tilted his head upwards, considering. Chapter 2. As he put on his worn tennis shoes in the locker room, Wade wasn't sure what to expect. He was happy to have the jumpsuit off at last and to no longer be constrained by a pair of cuffs. He was free. It would take a while to get used to the feeling. He pulled his jacket on and stared at his reflection in the nearby mirror. He needed to shave. More importantly, he needed a shower, a very long, hot shower. It had been 3 grueling years since he had taken what he considered to be a truly dignified bath. Living in prison meant that you had to forego certain daily conveniences, and Wade was all but ready to reclaim them. Looking at himself, he fought with his sleeves, trying to pull them down far enough so that they would cover his highly exposed wrists. His clothes no longer fit him. He'd be sure to jot down a shopping trip on his list of things to do. Wade stepped outside of the locker room and walked with 2 guards through the rec hall into the reception area. He went to the front counter and received his personal belongings. It was almost nostalgic, ripping open the small packet and emptying out its contents. He picked up his 3-year-old pack of stale cigarettes, his lighter, pocket knife, and his billfold, which was mysteriously missing the $35 Wade had inside of it at the time of his arrest. Walking out to the gatehouse was almost too overwhelming for him. He soon would be out and about in the city. No longer confined by walls, gates, fences, or guards. He could start a new life. He could finally start over. 3 years in the pen, and New York City still hadn't changed a bit. Wade stepped foot outside of the taxi cab and looked at the city around him. What struck him the most wasn't the people walking around, nor the tall buildings surrounding him, but the sound of it all. For too long he had been incarcerated with the same old constant noise, the loud clamor of guards walking up and down the hall, of inmates shouting, of cells opening and closing, of chains rattling, the long and continuous echoes. It had been maddening, but things were different now. He could hear the sound of cars running, people talking, horns honking in the distance. It was the sound of life, and he cherished every ounce of it. Rifling through his jacket, he pulled out a note card containing the address of his new home. The early release program that he had been granted would set him up with temporary residence and employment free of charge. All they asked for in return was total obedience to the law, as well as their very strict guidelines. It wasn't total freedom, but he didn't mind. He felt like a dog chained to a tree, but it was better than being a dog locked inside all day. And besides, after 2 years of probation, he would be free to go wherever he wanted, to do whatever he wanted. But for now, he would live with what he had. Crossing the street, he caught sight of a payphone. He walked over to it, dug around inside his pockets for a few quarters, and promptly plopped them into the machine. He looked at the phone number on the card and dialed it. After 2 rings, he was connected. "Yeah, I'm trying to reach Officer McDaniels." Wade spoke into the phone. "I was told to call this number when I was released." A few minutes later, he was in deep conversation with his parole officer. "You're to contact me every 24 hours. You're not to leave the state for the next year under any circumstances," McDaniels said over the phone. "You're to accept the employment you've been given by the parole board, and you must also complete your mandatory 30 hours of community service. You are in no way allowed to break curfew or any of the guidelines outlined in your contract whatsoever, or you'll face further detention." Wade sighed. "Should I let you know what I eat for breakfast, lunch, and dinner as well?" he quipped. McDaniels coughed, saying, "Look, I know it seems excessive, but getting out early means that we need to watch you at all times. It's how the system works. If you're unhappy, I could always file a grievance report and get you sent back here, if that's what you'd prefer." I got it, Wade frustratingly answered. "Anything else?" "I think that's it. We'll send you some paperwork at your new residence to fill out. Now keep in mind, if you get in any kind of trouble or if it looks for a second like you won't be able to support yourself, if there's a shadow of a doubt that you can't take care of yourself, you're going right back to state pen." Way to put the pressure on a guy, Wade thought. "Most importantly, son, just set a plan and stick to it. You've got to find your own way," the officer finished. Entering into his apartment, Wade couldn't help but have a bit of buyer's remorse. The place was a dump. Its walls were oppressive, and the environment was hateful. It was a single room, and small at that. Every element of a torn, retro suburban home had been jam-packed into a single, suffocating area. Its walls were lined with the mockeries of a rusted shower, an old dial television set, a torn sofa, a flimsy mattress, and other cheap decorations. Wade set his belongings on the rickety table and took a seat. He was facing a small 70s-style dartboard pinned on top of a large map of the country. The wall around it was falling apart, and Wade could clearly see a rusted water pipe through the drywall's holes. He extended his hand across the table and pulled a plastic cup containing several darts towards him. This wasn't exactly what he was expecting. Somewhere between the idea of being out on the city streets once again and being able to go to bed in a room larger than 12 feet on all sides, Wade had imagined that his new home would be a small taste of heaven. It never really clicked in his head that they would shove him in a junk heap on the bad side of town, but then again, why not? It made perfect sense. He was a felon. He should have never expected to be treated like a king once he was released. He was at the bottom of the barrel in terms of socioeconomic status. He was a bum. He had no cash, no car, no friends. At least none that had tried to contact him. Wade picked up a dart and threw it haphazardly at the dartboard, not caring to check where it landed. What was the point of all this? Was anything really going to change? Doubt began to creep into his mind. He had been told that this was a chance to start over. But how could he start over like this? He had been placed in living conditions that were worse than being in prison. How could he get better if the opportunities he was given were substandard? He threw another dart, this time missing completely, sending the dart behind the drywall. It hit the pipe and clattered to the ground. His whole life had been a missed opportunity. He was smart. He had been a straight-A student. He was 2 years ahead of the other kids his age in school. He was always called the child prodigy, but he never could quite live up to his potential. Things always seemed to get in the way. He was always bullied, picked on, made fun of growing up, and his dad certainly hadn't helped things either. Being in prison was better than being with him. But now that Wade was out, he wasn't sure if he could reclaim the life that he had lost. A knock on the door. Wade turned around and looked toward the apartment's entrance. Who would be coming to see him? He got up from his seat, slowly made his way over to the door, and opened it. The door quickly flew open, and pain instantly shot through Wade's stomach. He was shoved backwards, and then grabbed forcefully. "Make a sound, and it'll be your last." Wade felt cold metal being pressed against his chest, and when his eyes adjusted, he saw his attacker. Wearing a black hoodie and sporting a scarred cheek, the thief had a look of pure adrenaline in his eyes. The quiet click of a gun pulsed through Wade's eardrums. Just take it easy, pal," Wade stuttered, trying to recover his senses. "Shut up! Where's your wallet?" the thief yelled. "What?" Wade choked out, flustered. He felt the gun sink further into his chest, and he found it hard to breathe. "Did I stutter?" the man said. "Your wallet, now!" "Look, buddy, I don't have a wallet," Wade lied. He needed to stall for time to get his bearings. "Man, shut up! Do I look like I'm playing with you? Where's your money?" The thief was near breaking point now, and Wade realized he couldn't get out of this situation. He caved in. "Back pocket. But look, it's..." The thief grabbed Wade's wallet forcefully from his back pocket. He rifled through it, and finding nothing, threw it vehemently to the ground in anger. "I'm gonna give you one more chance, man. Where's your money?" he shouted. "Listen, pal, would you just listen? I just got out of juvie. I've got nothing to..." Wade was cut short, however, when the man threw a punch that hit Wade in the stomach hard. His knees buckled, and he crumpled to the cold floor in pain. Wade's eyes blurred. He fought to keep conscious, to stay awake, but eventually, a dark haze sank over his eyelids, and he felt his head slowly rest on the ground. Wade woke with a start and tilted his head up. His apartment was empty, and the door was hanging open. He felt fine for a few moments, and then his head began to throb with intense pressure. He moaned aloud and writhed on the floor helplessly for a few moments before crawling over to the table and pulling himself back up. "Well, that was interesting," he stated aloud, laughing pathetically at himself. He took a peek around the room, rubbing his temple gently. His wallet was gone, but the other items from lockup were still there. Maybe the thief had gotten spooked and left. Wade ran a hand through his hair and then spotted it. Or rather, didn't spot it. His watch. His golden watch. His favorite watch. Gone. Wade slammed his fist down on the table in frustration, the sound piercing his brain painfully. He jumped up from his seat and kicked it over. Pacing around the room, thoughts rushed into his head of everything that had led him to this point. Images raced through his memory of prison, his cell, the rec hall, the yard, the fighting, the robbery, the gun. He snapped out of his trance and scanned the map on the wall. He needed to get out. The words of the parole officer were echoing through his skull. If you get in any kind of trouble, or if it looks for a second like you won't be able to support yourself, if there's a shadow of a doubt that you can't take care of yourself. Wade looked over at the broken hinges of the door left from his intruder. There was no question. He had to leave. If they found out, he couldn't go back to prison, not after tasting an honest chance at freedom. Just set a plan and stick to it. You've got to find your own way. Wade caught his reflection in a broken mirror hanging on the wall. He couldn't even stand to look at himself. He needed to change, to find his own way, and he needed to do it now. Wade picked up a dart from the plastic cup and looked over the map. Anywhere would do. Anywhere but here. Someplace random. Someplace unexpected. Closing his eyes, he threw the dart sharply at the wall. He gritted his teeth as he heard it impact. This would decide everything. He opened his eyes and stepped towards the map. He placed his hand around the body of the dart and pulled it from its place. He lifted up his other hand and lightly touched the mark left behind. The hole was aligned perfectly to a small town in southern Kentucky. He moved his hand to the side to look at the plot. Printed lightly in thin black letters was the name of his new home, Munich, Kentucky. Chapter 3. How could she be late again? 20-year-old Harmony Wallace raced down the staircase of her very cozy upper-class home, taking care not to trip on the second-to-last step, which she always seemed to have trouble keeping track of. Family photos littered the walls, and she could hear the distant chattering of early morning breakfast coming from the kitchen. Harmony walked into the room and caught sight of her mother and father busying themselves. Her mother stood by the toaster, putting waffles on a plate and making coffee. Her father, an older man of 57 years, was sitting comfortably bound in his wheelchair, patiently waiting for his meal. Harmony quickly stepped toward the kitchen counter and began packing her book bag. "Slow down there, kiddo. You missed breakfast," her father said, smiling. "No time, Daddy. I'll be late for class," Harmony answered. She was slowly gaining a reputation for being the last one to arrive to her classroom each day, and she made a promise to herself that she would do better. "I can't honestly expect you kids to get a good education if you can't even eat breakfast in the mornings. I'm in college now, Daddy. They don't expect us to run on anything except caffeine and desperation." She heard her father chuckle. "I suppose you're right. Be home early?" he asked. "Late," Harmony replied. "I'm working 2 shifts tonight." Harmony crossed over to the sink and picked up her father's meal. Taking a sip of his coffee, she sat the plate in front of him gently. "You never slow down, do you?" he said, chuckling to himself. "Gotta stay ahead to survive," she answered, kissing him lightly on the cheek. As her mother took a seat across from her father, Harmony walked over to the counter to grab her things. "Wear a coat," said Miss Wallace. "It's still chilly from the rain last night." Harmony quickly grabbed her coat from the closet and threw it on. Slinging her bag over her shoulder, she made for the door. "I'll be home tonight. Love you. Bye." With the slam of the screen door, Harmony left. Good morning, Munich. This is KMWZ 102.1 with today's weather. Expect to get off to a slow start this morning after last night's sudden thunderstorm. A few power lines were down, but electric crews are working to get things restored as soon as possible. Expect a partly cloudy day with a slight chance of rain, high 65, low 44. And now for today's top stories. Harmony listened intently through her earbuds to the radio. The morning sun was beginning to peek out across the horizon line of Munich, casting a cool light upon the city streets. The atmosphere was still muggy from the thunderstorm the night previous, yet life still went on. Cars hustled and bustled through the traffic lights, farmers were opening up their barns, and people were just waking up, ready to go about their daily lives. Life in Munich was quiet. Harmony had lived in the town her entire life, and almost the entire population knew her by name. It was a very small lifestyle living in a town like Munich, and Harmony yearned for something more. She would jump at the chance to leave her life in the small town behind and start over someplace bigger, someplace better. She needed to move to a city full of opportunity, and that was something that Munich didn't provide. She was smart, though, and she knew she wouldn't last long if she wasn't properly prepared, so she waited. She was going to finish school before venturing out into the world, and she needed to make sure that she had enough money to afford living expenses in the big city. She had been preparing for a long time, and she still had quite a few things to take care of before she would be ready. Harmony passed by the gas station and waved at the owner through the window. He waved back and nodded to her politely. Pedaling a bit faster in time to make the traffic light, she slowly slid across the street and around the town's only no biking zone. She checked her watch. Given her current speed, she would probably be around 15 minutes late. She pressed down further on the pedals, knowing that it would ultimately be fruitless. She would have to deal with another lecture from her professor. What would it be, the fifth one this month? Harmony crossed in front of a stopped bus, waved to the driver, and hung a sharp left, trying to pick up speed. Wade exited the bus behind two others. He stuffed the small state map into his pocket and looked around. So this was Munich. He liked it. It was small, a real-life blink-and-you'll-miss-it cowtown. He couldn't help but stand in awe at the vast differences between New York and his new home. Where the Big Apple was pure noise, this place was quiet. He could hear birds chirping. Few cars were in the street. The buildings were small. There wasn't a crowd in sight. It was perfect. Just the place to go out at. Wade scanned the street and caught sight of a gas station a few yards down. He pulled his hair behind his face and walked towards it. It felt good to clean up. Wade finished clipping his hair and set the pair of scissors on the sink. It was a horribly uneven haircut, but at least it wasn't in his face anymore. Turning on the hot water, he cupped his hands and splashed some on his face, taking care to not agitate the spot on his chin where he had cut himself shaving. It had been the first real time he had seen himself like this since his incarceration, and as he stood in the middle of the gas station's locked men's room, he couldn't help but wonder about his friends. Why hadn't they come to visit him? He already knew the answer, but deep in his heart, he wondered why they hadn't even attempted to see him. He wondered if they still cared, if she still cared. Should he call her? It would be good to hear her voice one last time, to know that she was okay, to see if she still thought about him. Wade stepped outside the men's room and walked up to the front counter. He would put it on his to-do list, but first he needed to take care of life's essentials. "Can I help you?" asked the clerk. Wade peered over to the tobacco products. Could I get a pack of smokes?" The clerk eyed him over suspiciously. "You got any ID?" Wade opened his mouth to speak, but finding no words, promptly shut it. The clerk made a disappointed snort and shook her head. He should have kept the goatee. Chapter 4. What would happen in such a situation, Miss Wallace? Harmony looked up from her hospital internship form and stared blankly at her professor. Whoops. She probably should have been paying attention. Around her, students who had either been sleeping or taking notes looked over to stare at her. I'm sorry, sir?" The professor cranked his head to the side and folded his arms. "Have you managed to find something more beneficial than my lecture to spend your time on, Miss Wallace?" No, sir." She saw the professor grin, clearly soaking up the opportunity to harass her. "Are you sure?" he said in a mocking voice, "because if it's any more important than passing my class, feel free to tell us all about it." She looked around. Students were peering over at her and laughing at each other. Embarrassed, Harmony looked down at her desk. It isn't, I'm sorry." "Yes, well then, can you please tell me what would happen if the tape were to come in contact with an acid instead of a base?" She didn't even have to look at her notes. "It would turn a lighter color." "That would be correct," the professor replied. The bell sounded, marking a new hour. The professor looked to the class. "That would be where we end our lecture for today. Your assignment is on page 436. It's due Thursday, ladies and gentlemen. Harmony, I'd like to see you up here, please." Great. As the rest of the class piled out of the room, Harmony reluctantly walked to the front where her professor was waiting. "Here we go again," she thought. As the last student exited the classroom, her professor turned to look at her. "Harmony, look, if you have any intention at all of passing my class this semester, you're going to have to put forth a little more work ethic than you've been doing," he said. "Yes, sir. Is there anything going on that you need help with?" he questioned. "No, sir. I've just been having to juggle between jobs right now, and I'm trying to make ends meet around the house. Look, contrary to popular belief, I don't get any joy out of beguiling you or the rest of the students," he said while sitting himself down on top of his desk leisurely. "I just want you to succeed." Harmony didn't have time for this. She was on a schedule, and a lecture about being late was going to end up making her even more late. "I understand, sir," she said quickly, "and thank you." Harmony turned around and took a step toward the door to leave. Harmony, her professor called. Yes, sir, she said, turning to look at him. He stared back at her with tight eye contact. Don't be afraid to ask for help if you need it. She nodded. I won't, and I'm fine, thank you. Harmony stepped outside the classroom and took a few soft steps until out of earshot, and then broke into a run. Harmony flew by on her bike, pedaling as fast as possible. She couldn't be late twice in the same day. It was getting ridiculous. She passed by several people on her way to work. There were kids playing on the park's swing set, some hoodlum was stumbling around smoking a cigarette, and a strange-looking man was standing in an alley. Why was it that she was the only one who ever seemed to be in a hurry? You're late, Pops. It'll cost you extra. Not my fault. Traffic. Two men approached one another in a small alleyway. One was carrying a large duffel bag, dressed in dark clothes and a gray beanie, sporting a beard. The other, a taller man in his 40s, walked up nervously. Man, you and I both know this podunk town ain't got traffic, said the man with the bag. Look, I told you it's not my fault. You got what I want? As long as you got my money. Hey, look, bud, I've got your money. Don't you worry about that. Just outside the alley, a few yards down, an unmarked black van was waiting patiently. Inside sat two men listening to the conversation taking place in the alley over headphones. Yeah, whatever you say. Just make sure it's worth my time, they heard the man with the bag say over the airwaves. In the driver's seat, dressed in full police uniform, Officer Morgan of the Munich Police Department turned up the volume on his headset. It was a routine drug sting. They had received several reports of a man selling cocaine in this area, and they had sent an undercover officer to purchase drugs from him. You're wasting both our times with all this smack, and let's hurry this up so I can get back to work, came the voice of the undercover detective Dan Palmer. Morgan turned to the man in the van's passenger seat. There's that work line. He's got a visual, Morgan said. Sitting next to him and lazily scribbling on a pad of paper was Deputy Commissioner Franks. Wonderful, Franks spoke nonchalantly. You think this department can actually muster up the ability to catch the guy this time? Classic Franks, Morgan thought, always trying to talk down to everyone around him. Look, Franks, you and I both know Detective Palmer's an expert at these kinds of things. He could have transferred to someplace bigger and done some real good. New York, Los Angeles even. But he stayed here in Kentucky for his family, and he still puts in the most work out of the entire department. Believe me, this'll be the last day this dealer walks the streets. Franks chuckled. I'm not here to trust anyone, Officer Morgan. I'm just here to evaluate your and Detective Palmer's performance during this operation. Just get this guy in cuffs, and you can be sure to keep your ridiculously low government salary for another year. Morgan let out an aggravated sigh as he turned the van on. Yes, sir. The dealer unzipped his bag while he looked around slowly, carefully separating two of the front flaps to reveal its contents, several bags of cocaine. Palmer looked into the bag and nodded. Looks like this guy's for real, he thought. He just hoped Morgan was ready to close the deal. How much for a bag? Palmer asked. 80. 80? Palmer replied in mock shock, trying his best to keep the act up. I told you it was going to cost you extra for making me wait, the dealer replied. You best be here early next time. I don't know, Palmer speculated. It's pure. Palmer looked around and slowly nodded. All right, I got you. Palmer reached into his back pocket for his cuffs, and by the time he realized his mistake, it was too late. As he reached into his pocket, he saw the wire from his one-way radio sticking out from his jacket. Any hope that perhaps the dealer hadn't seen it was instantly shattered when Palmer felt himself being kicked to the dirt. The rocky surface of the ground tore against Palmer's jacket as he made impact, and the handcuffs he had reached for fell limply to his side. The dealer let out a curse as he shoved his foot into Palmer's side once more, and he took off. Palmer grunted loudly in pain as he tucked his head in. How could he have been so stupid? Why didn't he check to make sure the wire would stay in place beforehand? He inhaled sharply, trying desperately to catch his breath as he pulled a headset from his jacket pocket. Runner! Going down the opposite side! Circle around to cut him off! Palmer heard the distant screeching of tires as he knew Morgan and Franks would take care of business. He lifted himself up, put his earpiece in properly, pulled out his sidearm, and flipped the safety off. Be aware, suspect may be armed. Don't lose this guy. Looks like he's headed down West Street. I'm in pursuit on his 6, Palmer shouted, taking off toward the dealer. Game time. Chapter 5. Wade walked down the sidewalk at the local park, flicking his finished cigarette onto the street. He placed his hands in his pockets and looked over the horizon. Just get up the nerve to do it, he told himself, but he wasn't ready yet. He needed more time. Wade crossed into the main area of the park and headed towards a small pond. He needed somewhere quiet to think, to get ready. This was the biggest decision he was ever going to make in his life. His last. He stood overlooking the pond, closed his eyes, and let the subtle breeze wash over him. A few drops of almost rain hit his forehead. He bent over and picked up a small rock, looking it over. This place was quiet. He turned the rock on its side and threw it with a sharp curve, sending it skipping lightly across the small pond once, twice, 3 times, and then a series of small skips that Wade had never really ever thought counted. His mind went back to when he would go to his aunt's boat out on the dock. He would stand on the banks of the lake, all 5 years, 3 feet and 2 inches of him, skipping rocks and watching the boats float on the river. Sailing was his guilty pleasure that he rarely got to take part in, but he cherished any moment that it would present itself to him. He remembered when he was 8, he tried to swim in the lake for the first time without a life jacket. His aunt and uncle had always made him wear one, but he snuck out that afternoon to see if he could do without it. He swam out a bit too far from the boat, and the waves started to take him away from safety. He desperately kicked his legs as hard as his 8-year-old body allowed him to, but try as he might, he just couldn't fight against the tide. He had to yell for his aunt to come get him, and after the entire ordeal was over, he had tried to stay away from the water as much as possible. For Wade, the episode on the boat had been the first time he ever thought he was going to die. He stared down at himself and wondered, how far had he managed to float out by now? He skipped another rock and breathed heavily, trying to erase the thoughts from his mind. Digging in his pocket, he pulled out the last remaining cigarette he had managed to swipe from the front counter of the gas station. Placing it in his mouth, he took out his small silver lighter he had received from lockup. He flicked the lighter a few times to no avail. Holding it up to his ear, he shook it. Empty. Wade tossed the lighter into the pond, watching it hit the water a long distance away. He placed the smoke back into his jacket pocket. "Don't suppose you could spare a cent or two?" a voice said behind him. Wade spun around, startled. Slowly walking up to him was an elderly homeless man. He was wearing a very torn overcoat, a scarf, and he smelled terrible. His hair was long and knotted, and his face had patches of dirt all around it, paired with a small set of gray eyes that carried a look of defeat. "Just a little bit of change?" he asked somberly. Wade looked to the ground. "Sorry, I've got nothing for you," Wade finally replied. The man stared at Wade for a moment, and then slowly began to walk away. As he turned around, Wade caught a glimpse of a bottle tucked haphazardly into the man's coat pocket. Wade thought for a moment. "Actually," Wade threw out, causing the man to turn back around to him, "I've got some spare change, if you wouldn't mind selling me something of yours." Wade nodded down toward the bottle in the man's pocket. It wasn't the best stuff, but it worked, Wade thought as he took another drink. He was now sitting quite comfortably on a park bench, his newly purchased bottle in hand. It had been 3 years since his last drink, and he honestly didn't miss it that much. He had never really been into hard liquor, and tasting from the bottle he now had in his possession, he wasn't quite sure he found it that enjoyable. Wade dug around in his jacket pocket and pulled out the other item he managed to take from the gas station undetected, a small, pocket-sized leather book. Wade opened it up and slowly flipped through its blank pages. He didn't know why he had taken it, but nevertheless it found its way into his jacket. Ever since he had become a teenager and started high school, he had gotten a thrill out of taking things, out of evading capture, out of not being caught. But he had been caught, and getting caught once was all it really took. He was tired of prison, of being haunted with his past. He needed to get it all out of his head before he did what he had traveled to Munich to do. And that meant calling her. Wade looked up and eyed a payphone standing on the other side of the parkway. He took one last drink and made his way towards it. "Time to get it over with. It's the last thing you'll ever have to worry about," Wade told himself as he picked up the phone. He put his hand in his front pocket and wrestled around to find some coins. He pulled out a quarter and a single penny. He had given the rest of his change for the liquor. Wade stared at the bottle that he had set on top of the payphone in disgust. It stared back, laughing at his pathetic predicament. Frustrated, Wade punched in a few numbers that corresponded with a sticker plastered beside the keypad. "Collect call for," came the automatic voice. Wade punched in a few more numbers and prepared himself. "Connecting." The phone line began to ring. Wade swallowed, looking around the park as if searching for a nearby exit, looking for a reason to be able to hang up the phone. Another ring. Wade looked up at the payphone sign while the line rang twice more. He couldn't do it. Wade slammed the phone down on the receiver and hung up. He rubbed his head in shame and then shoved it into the payphone, hard. Why was he such an idiot? Why couldn't he work up the guts for a single phone call? Was he afraid? She hadn't visited him during his entire stint, 3 years. They'd been so close, and yet 3 years passed without a word. No letter, no call, nothing. Had she found someone else? Of course she did. There's not a single reason she would wait for you. Disheartened, Wade left the park and walked down the street, crossing into an empty alley. He staggered a bit as he finished the bottle. This was all pointless. If he couldn't get up the nerve, then he was just wasting time. Wade chucked the bottle against the brick wall, sending glass everywhere. Sitting down on the pavement, he ran his hand through his hair. Tears were coming from his eyes, and he made no effort to stop them. It didn't matter now. None of it mattered. Harmony kicked up her wheels as fast as possible, finally arriving at the restaurant. She gave a wave to several customers eating outside as she rode by them. Swinging her bike around to the back, she parked and hopped off, racing inside. Harmony walked into the restaurant's kitchen through the back door, breathing heavily from pedaling so much. She threw her bag on the ground and hung her jacket up. A voice came from the adjacent room. "You're late, girl." Stephen, a young man in his early 20s, peeked through the doorway at Harmony. He was tall and sported a purple hairnet, which kept his curly red hair pulled behind him. Harmony looked at him. I know, I got out of class late. It won't happen again," she said. "Whatever, I can't keep covering for you all the time." I got it, came Harmony's reply. Stephen was the closest thing to a brother that Harmony had in the past year. He was always dependable and easy to rely on, cool and collected. He was a nice breath of fresh air from Harmony's routinely busy schedule. Harmony crossed into the main kitchen where Stephen was slicing bread. She headed to a nearby cabinet and pulled out an apron and a hat. She put them on while smiling to him and crossed over to the sink to wash her hands. "How's your dad doing, by the way?" Stephen asked as she scrubbed in. "He's fine," Harmony replied. "He's got a doctor's appointment in about a month." "Any change?" Stephen questioned. "Not really." "Well, I'll keep praying." "Thanks," said Harmony. "I really appreciate it." Stephen was that kind of good-natured soul that always made you feel better when you were down. Ever since her father had been diagnosed, she found it hard to talk to people about the possibility of slowly losing her father over time. Stephen, for all Harmony could tell, was pretty religious and devout in his faith. He always had the right thing to say, to cheer her up, or even just to make her laugh. "Cheer up, Harmony," he said brightly. "You've got that gloomy look on your face. It's going to be a beautiful day tomorrow. Get ready for it." Harmony laughed to herself. Okay, maybe sometimes he was a little too cheerful. But Harmony didn't mind. It was a nice break from the people she attended college with. Most of them seemed like the type of people that only knew how to function while being unhappy, and she didn't want to become like that. Besides, Stephen was fun and easy to work with during the afternoon, and Harmony wasn't sure if she'd give it up for anything. "Did I ever tell you that you're too happy all the time, Stephen?" Harmony said, grinning. "Yep, but I ignored it," Stephen responded with a cheesy smile. He passed her a pair of disposable gloves, which she put on. "Whatever. Hey, did you hear about an opening down at the bookstore?" she said while looking at him. Stephen grunted and peeked over at her, speculating. "An opening? Don't you have 3 or 4 jobs already?" "I just need to get a little bit of cash together," Harmony returned. "Apparently a lot more than a little bit. When are you going to start slowing down?" Harmony pulled down a loaf of bread and began slicing it. "When I kick the bucket, most likely," half talking to herself. Stephen had a point. She had been working herself to death, but she couldn't take a break right now. There was too much left to do. Once she got enough money together and finished school, she'd be free to do anything she wanted. She just hoped her life would still be worth living by then. Harmony passed the rest of the loaf to Stephen at the sound of the door chime. She walked through the swinging doors out to the front counter where a man and his child were waiting to order their meal. Harmony looked at them and smiled politely, pushing the thoughts to the back of her mind. "Hi, can I take your order?" Chapter 6. Palmer cut across the grass and ran full pace. He heard a horn honk and witnessed Morgan swerving the police van sharply into a parked position on the side of the road as a group of old men sitting at a nearby barber shop's front porch looked on. Morgan and Franks jumped out of the van, both drawing their weapons. "You see him?" Palmer asked frantically, finally meeting up with them. He took this opportunity to take a short breath. "No, we didn't see him," Franks shouted, disgusted. "What happened? Someone tip him off?" "What? No, he... Palmer fumbled around with his words. How could he explain himself? "Did he cut across an alley?" Morgan interjected. Frustrated, Palmer pointed at both of them. "I told you two to cut him off." "Cut him off from where?" Frank shot back loudly. "You never gave us a location." "I gave you West Street." "West Street and what? You gave us nothing." Palmer pushed past Franks and scanned the horizon. Franks turned around and advanced toward Palmer. "What kind of performance is this from my senior detective?" he roared. "Shut up, Franks," Palmer cut in, making a move toward him as well. Morgan stepped between them and held both of them apart. "Hey, look, we're not getting anywhere standing around arguing like this," he said. Palmer backed away from Frank slowly, eyes hot with frustration. "Did you get a positive ID?" Morgan asked Palmer as calmly as possible. "Yes, it's the guy," Palmer shouted. "I'll call it in," Morgan said while pulling out his radio. "Oh, for crying out loud!" came the put-out voice of Frank's. Palmer ran his hands through his hair and craned his neck over toward the adjacent street. "All right, look, we'll split up," he called. "I'll take west. Morgan, you go south. Franks can take east." Franks holstered his sidearm and shot his hands into the air, looking at Palmer. "And what if he's decided to double back?" he complained. Palmer put his firearm away and prepared himself for another run. He looked over, giving one last glance to Franks. 3 out of 4 is better than nothing at all. Even you ought to know that. Now let's go." Franks looked at Morgan, who ducked into the police van. "Call it in. Go south," he commanded roughly. "Yes, sir." Palmer turned around and broke into a full sprint, determined to fix his mistake. Wade stood next to the payphone, listening to endless rings. He had finally worked up the nerve to call again, and he promised himself he wouldn't hang up this time. "Hi, you've reached Catherine. I can't get to the phone right now, so leave me a message." Wade opened his mouth to speak. What would he say? How would he say it? He hung the phone back up and stepped away from it. There was nothing to say, nothing that would matter anyway. He and Catherine might have been dating at the time, but 3 years had gone by. She had moved on and found someone else. She wasn't interested in him anymore. Why would she be? What did a lowlife like him have to offer her? Wade staggered back over to the park bench and plopped himself down. He ran his hands through his greasy hair and hung his head low. That was the end of it. There was no one left to look up. No one who cared to speak with him, at least. He was alone. There was nothing more for him to do. Wade slowly lifted himself from the bench and made for the exit. With a thud, he accidentally ran into a man walking by him. "Hey, watch where you're going, kid," the man shouted. "Sorry," Wade mumbled meekly. As Wade walked away, he heard the man shouting to thin air angrily. "This is Franks. I'm getting nothing on my end. The guy probably doubled back." Harmony stood at the front counter, twirling her hair lazily. It was a slow afternoon at the restaurant. She leaned against the cash register and peered out to the parking lot, wondering if any cars were in the process of pulling in. Nothing. Suddenly, she heard her cell phone beep. Placing her hand in her pocket, she punched a button down to shut the sound off and pulled it out to see who was calling. The daycare. Harmony looked around the restaurant and, feeling satisfied that everything would go smoothly while she was gone, made her way into the employee restroom in the back. "Hello?" She spoke into the phone upon locking the door. "Harmony, you coming into work today?" It was Lacey, one of Harmony's coworkers at the daycare. "Yeah, but my shift isn't until 4 o'clock, Harmony responded. There was a pause on the other end. "Would you mind coming in a little early? The school just called and told me that my brother's sick, so I need to go pick him up." Harmony tilted her head back. There was always something. I'm in the middle of class right now. I don't think I can make it," Harmony lied. "Did you call Karen?" "She said to call you." Harmony sighed to herself and rubbed her forehead, thinking. The daycare didn't know that she had a different job. They had simply assumed she was a student, and Harmony hadn't bothered to correct them. If she didn't handle this situation properly, they could find out about her job at the restaurant. She wouldn't risk it. "What time do you need me there?" Harmony asked, annoyed. "Can you get here by 1? That could be a problem, Harmony thought to herself. "Hold on a minute, I'll check," she told Lacey. Harmony set her phone down and stepped out of the restroom. She would need to make some quick decisions to pull this off. She crossed into the kitchen and found Stephen mixing some ingredients in a bowl, humming Amazing Grace to himself. "Hey, Stephen," Harmony called innocently. "Hey, yeah?" he replied cheekily. "Listen, I know it's short notice and all," she began, "but would you mind watching the rest of my shift?" Stephen stopped stirring and spun around, facing her. "Are you serious?" "I'm really sorry," said Harmony. "Something came up at work, and they need my—" "This is your work, girl," Stephen pointed out. Harmony stepped toward him. She would need a bargain. She wrapped herself around him in a bear hug, causing his cheeks to turn as red as his hair. "Pretty please? I'll buy you lunch for the whole week, pretty please?" she pleaded sweetly. Stephen stared at her for a moment, and then smiled. "Lunch and breakfast, you mean?" "I'm not exactly made of money, you know," Harmony returned. "Whatever, lunch is fine." Harmony smiled, her mission a success. "Thanks," she said, hurrying towards the restroom. "I'll clock you out," Stephen called. Harmony nodded. "Bye." Harmony returned to the restroom and picked up her phone. Checking her watch, she figured she'd be able to make it there in time if she cut across a few alleys. "Hey, you still there?" she asked Lacey. "Yeah? I'll be there at 1, okay?" "Thanks a lot, Harmony." "No problem." Harmony hung up the phone and placed it in her pocket. Heading out to the restroom door, she took off her hat and apron, placing them quickly in a nearby basket. She headed towards the back door and retrieved her book bag and jacket. Once out the door, she swung herself over her bike and smacked her heel against the kickstand. Setting one foot solidly on the ground, she pivoted the bike and turned it around, taking off toward the daycare as fast as possible. Chapter 7. Throwing himself over the fence, Palmer hit the ground with a start. He searched the street from top to bottom, coming out empty-handed. Where was this guy at? He couldn't have gotten too far away. Palmer anticipated that at most the dealer had managed to get a minute's worth of a head start. Palmer jogged around to the front of a local building, trying to catch his breath as best he could. The guy must have been cutting corners constantly, Palmer thought. "Come on," Palmer said out loud to himself in frustration. "He's got to be around here some—" Palmer froze. Off to his left, he caught sight of him. The dealer was hunched over, his upper body stuck inside of a car he seemed to be hot wiring. Palmer raised his weapon and took aim. "Freeze!" he shouted. The dealer looked up surprised, and in one swift motion pointed a revolver towards Palmer and fired off several shots. Dirt kicked up around Palmer's heels as he fired back once, and the front windshield of the car shattered. The dealer forcibly threw himself to the ground behind the car and fired back blindly. As the sound of bullets flew past him, Palmer took cover behind a nearby wall and pulled out his radio. "This is Detective Palmer," he said, trying to keep calm. "I need backup on South and Main. Suspect is armed and taking fire." Palmer pocketed the radio and pulled himself out from the cover of the wall into a firing position. The dealer took off down an alley, and Palmer rose to his feet, grabbing the radio once more. "Suspect is on foot and heading south. I'm in pursuit." Keeping his weapon close, Palmer ran after him. Wade traipsed around the outskirts of the town, slowly walking over a bridge. His eyes were damp, and his head was throbbing in pain. He knew what he needed to do next, but he hadn't worked up the nerve. Lifting himself up with the steel railing, he looked down the river several yards below him. Jagged rocks outstretched the body of water, and Wade swallowed. He looked over the horizon. Should he jump? It might not work. What if the fall alone didn't kill him? It would be painful beyond belief, and he would lay there for several days before he either bled out or someone found him. And if the latter happened, he would be sent back to jail, and that was torture enough. He needed a better plan. Lowering himself to the railing, he scanned the town. If he was going to do this, he needed to go out in a way that would be the least agonizing. Something quick, something simple, something final. Walking down the road, now across from the grocery store, Wade saw it. A small building with a large yellow sign that stretched forth to the sky. The answer to all his problems, the solution to everything. Munich Pawn and Gun. She might actually make it there on time. Harmony glided along the road towards the daycare, skating over a small puddle. A car passed by on the opposite end of the street, and she waved politely, smiling. She felt bad leaving Stephen to do all the work, but she couldn't risk losing her job at the daycare. It might have paid less, but Harmony needed the extra money that it offered. Stephen was a good friend, though, and he didn't seem to put up too much of a complaint. She would pay him back later. Harmony's thought was cut short at the sound of grinding gears. Her bike's front pedal began to lock up, and she let out a yelp as the bike jerked to a halt, sending her forward. She put out a hand to catch herself, threw down the kickstand, and hopped off the bike. Of course it would break, thought Harmony. Why on earth would anything go right for her today? Did she really honestly believe that things could be looking up? She pushed the bike off the street and over to the alley. Harmony kneeled down onto her knees and surveyed her bike. Something was wrong with the brake cord. Harmony ran her hand across it lightly. Maybe if she could... Harmony screamed. She felt herself being lifted up off her feet. "Shut up!" shouted a deep voice from behind her. The man yanked her hair with force. One hand was across her throat, his other groping her chest tightly. Harmony's feet flailed, knocking her bike to the ground. "Help me!" she screamed. A hand dropped over her mouth, and she began to be pulled into the alley. "Shut up before I put a bullet in your head!" Harmony kicked her legs into the air, trying to break free, but to no avail. The man had a firm grip on her, and she couldn't get loose. He dragged her into the alley and threw her roughly against the wall. Pain shot through her back as she felt her body impact with the cement wall behind her, and her eyes finally focused on the man. He pulled out a small revolver from his back pocket and pressed it deep into her neck. Harmony gagged and tried to gasp for air. "Freeze!" She looked behind her attacker to see another man pointing a gun at him. Harmony's collar was grabbed and she was spun forward, the revolver placed directly against her head. "Shut up!" her attacker yelled to the other man. "You take one step closer and she dies." "Take it easy, man. No one needs to get hurt here." Harmony felt the gun click against her head. "You drop your piece and no one will." There was a short pause. The attacker pulled Harmony closer. "I'm not saying it again! Drop your gun!" he shouted, holding Harmony tighter. What should he do? Palmer stood a few yards away from the alley, his gun aimed directly at the dealer. He had a clear shot. Every part of his mind was telling him to take it, but he didn't know if he should risk it. He already made one mistake today. Did he really want to risk putting someone else in danger? Frustrated, Palmer set his gun to the ground. The girl stared at him unblinkingly, silently screaming at him for help. "All right, gun's gone, now just let her go," Palmer shouted. The dealer pulled the girl to her feet and looked at him. "Shut up and stay there," he yelled at Palmer. Palmer obeyed, not moving an inch. He was defenseless now, but much more than his own safety, he couldn't risk having her hurt. The dealer dragged the girl out of the alley and took off, holding her close at his side. Palmer waited 2 seconds and then made for his gun. He picked it up and grabbed his radio. "This is Detective Palmer. Be advised, suspect has a hostage. Repeat, suspect has a hostage." Chapter 8. Wade rummaged through the supply room as quietly as possible. The owner would probably be back from lunch at any moment, so he needed to hurry. All of the items were locked in different gates, and he couldn't find a key to any one of them. Finally, he managed to get hold of a crowbar in the room's closet. Wade made his way to the center locker, propping the lock up. He raised the crowbar above his head, took aim, and swung down. Missed. Blame the booze, Wade thought to himself. He lifted the crowbar once more and swung. With a loud crack, the lock bent sharply inwards. Wade swung once more, this time severing the lock in half. Wade removed the fragment of the lock that was still attached to the gate and tossed it on the ground. He lifted the gate's lever upwards and pulled. The gate opened up smoothly, and Wade pulled out one of the many boxes it housed. He set it on a nearby table and propped it open. Removing the foam covering, he withdrew a very sleek, very smooth, black handgun. He walked towards the other end of the supply room and reached into an unlocked cabinet to retrieve ammunition. This should do the trick. Wade had surrendered himself from the possibility that he would change. Ever since leaving New York, his plan had been simple. Tie up any loose ends, and then finish it. He wanted to end it all the countless days of feeling empty, of feeling soulless. He was tired of running from the inevitable. He had suffered his whole life, and things weren't going to get any better. Wade heard the front door of the shop open. He turned around and peeked out of the storage room. The shop owner was moving several boxes into the storefront through the doorway, and Wade silently slipped out from storage and crept his way out of the building through the back door that he had broken in from. Quickly, he stuffed the gun into his pocket and left the scene. She was going to die. Harmony cowered in fear as she was pushed against another wall. The man had dragged her along for about a block before deciding she was too much trouble. Had he decided to go on without her? And if he had, what did that mean for her? "Give me your bag." Please don't kill me," she whimpered. Harmony's cheek stung as the man slapped her violently across the face. "I said, give me your bag!" The man forcibly grabbed Harmony by the hair and yanked backwards. He placed his hand on her bag and pulled it toward himself. He began to rummage through it, and Harmony stood still, frozen against the wall, fearing for her life. It was time. Wade sat behind a building, resting slightly against a cooling unit, preparing himself. Where had he gone wrong? Did it even matter now? Did the path one traveled on really matter once you reached the final destination? So many things had happened to him, and in such a short amount of time. 3 years ago, he had entered into prison with the promise that things would be different once he got out. And yet, here he was. By different, did they mean worse? He was at the lowest point in his life. He had searched his mind and finally come to the conclusion. He was at rock bottom. There was nothing to live for, nowhere for him to go, no one who cared for him. He was empty. He meant nothing to the world, and the world meant nothing to him. He'd been chewed up, spit out, and belittled to being less than dirt. Anytime he tried to do something for himself, anytime he tried to fix things, there was always another obstacle in his path, ready to knock him down again. If that was all life had to offer, he could do without. Wade looked around to make sure he was alone, and then pulled the gun out from his jacket pocket. He ejected the empty magazine and dug around in the jacket for a bullet. He pulled one out. A single golden trinket, no more than an inch tall, was about to be his salvation from everything. It felt almost poetic, summarizing his entire existence into such a minuscule object. How could something so small offer so many things when he himself could put forth nothing of value? He slipped the bullet into the magazine and made sure the spring was functioning properly. Should he write a note? Leave a message? What would he say? Who would he even say it to? No, he would leave this between himself and the gun, the only two objects in the world that meant anything to him. The gun meant an out. It meant relief. It meant freedom. Wade looked up to the horizon. It was fitting, seeing the sun obscured by the clouds. He raised the gun to his head and pressed the barrel lightly against his temple. A few moments of silence passed as Wade shut his eyes tightly and held his breath. "I'm sorry," he whispered. Images flashed through his mind of his mother, all the pain she suffered, the things she had to endure, his father, the things he did to her and to him, the prison, that terrible place, isolation, loneliness, his cell, the four corners, the smell of the air, the sound of the inmates, all flooding back to him as if his whole life was playing out inside of his mind in time for the finale. His lungs were aching for air, his brain started to slow down. Wade felt his finger tense up as he began to pull the trigger back. The sound of a scream caused Wade's eyes to shoot open, and he lowered the gun as he took a sharp inhale. He threw the gun as far away from himself as he could and stared down at it in disbelief. Tears were streaming down his cheeks, and he covered his face in his hands as he took an unsteady breath. He heard the scream once more, and his head pulled itself up to look around. Something was wrong. The man threw her bag aside and kicked her feet out from under her, causing the back of her head to hit the wall hard. "I told you to shut up!" he shouted, putting his boot on her shoulder and pressing hard. Harmony let out a cry of pain and then felt herself getting picked up by her jacket once again. "You're lucky I need you alive so they don't gun me down," he said, putting his face millimeters away from hers. She felt his hand glide over her waist, and he grabbed her hip. "Maybe if I'm lucky enough to get out of here, you and I can spend some alone time together." Harmony spat in his face. If he was going to hurt her, she wasn't going to make it fun for him. He cursed angrily and slammed his knee into her side, grabbing her neck. "Hey!" Harmony felt his grip loosen, and she turned to see someone walking slowly up to their position. He had to have been a teenager. He was dressed in worn-out clothes that were too small for him, and his hair was uneven and messy. He walked slowly, as if in a daze. "Let her go!" he shouted defiantly. "What'd you say to me?" her attacker called back, pure rage building in his dilated eyes. "I said let her go, or you're gonna have a bigger problem on your hands." As Harmony felt the grip around her neck loosen, the man threw her bag to the ground and stared at the boy. "You best go back where you came from if you know what's good for you," he threatened. Harmony saw the boy quicken his pace, pulling out a small silver knife from his back pocket. "Last chance!" the boy shouted as he closed in. Harmony's attacker threw her aside and pointed the gun towards him. "I got your last chance right here, pal. Drop that knife and turn around." Harmony hit the ground hard, cutting her palm open on a jagged rock sticking up from the dirt. Should she make a run for it? She turned to look at the boy, who continued to walk towards them. He was going to get himself killed. She needed to do something, or else no one would get out of this situation alive. Wade stepped closer and closer. Gun or no gun, the man wasn't going to scare him away. Wade tightened the grip on his pocket knife. He wasn't scared to die. This could be his last chance to go out as a hero. "I said to drop that knife!" Wade moved into a full sprint, clenching the knife in his fist. He would be on him in 2 seconds. The man let out a yell, and Wade watched as the girl kicked him hard in the stomach, knocking him off balance. The man pulled the trigger, and the bullet hit a dumpster, missing Wade by a mile. Wade collided with him, knocking the gun away. Wade threw a right hook, but the man ducked just in time to catch him with a swing of his own. As Wade lost his footing, the man lifted him high and threw him against the wall. Wade felt his back slam against solid force, and the knife flew from his hands almost as fast as the air from his lungs. Wade stumbled back onto solid ground and took another shot to his face. He needed to focus. Wade ducked the next blow and threw a lefty, catching the man's shoulder. They traded shots, and Wade lost all hearing when he was hit with a surprise punch. The man kicked Wade to the ground, and he laid there, trying desperately to get back up and catch his breath. Wade saw the man pick up his knife and take a step toward him. Wade's eyes lost focus. The sense of sound came rushing back to him, and he heard the man yell out in pain. Wade shook his head and looked up. The man was lying on the ground, unconscious, with the girl standing over him, holding a metal pipe and carrying an expression of shock. Bloodied and bruised, Wade lifted himself up and gave the man one final kick. The girl dropped the pipe and huddled against the wall. "Thanks," Wade said, looking at her. "Same to you," she returned quietly. Wade limped over to the side of the building and picked up his knife. "Freeze!" Wade looked up to see two men coming toward him aiming guns. One was in a suit, the other in a police uniform. His basic instincts kicked in, and he turned around to go the other way. Another man appeared from the opposite end with a pistol drawn on him as well. "Drop your weapons, son! On the ground now!" There was nowhere to run. He was sandwiched in. He heard the girl screaming. Reluctantly, Wade tossed his knife to the ground and dropped to his knees, hands raised. His cheek tore against the ground's textured surface as the officer pushed his head to the ground, and his wrists stung sharply as an ice-cold set of handcuffs locked into place. Chapter 9. So much for the best of intentions, Wade thought to himself as he was being escorted down the hallway of the Munich Police Department. His wrists were raw from the familiar grip of cold metal cuffs. Leading him along was an officer who called himself Morgan. Wade got the distinct feeling that the man was rather new at his job by the way he walked. Policemen always had that walk that established themselves as supreme authorities, but Morgan was different. Judging by the lack of classic decorative patches worn by most officers, Wade deduced that Morgan hadn't been at his job for more than a year. Then again, it was a small town. Things might have worked differently in Munich, so Wade wasn't quite ready to put all his chips on the table. A buzzer sounded as Wade was led into a small room containing a table and two chairs. Interrogation Room. Wade looked around and noticed 4 solid walls without a mirror. The department must not have been able to afford one. Wade laughed to himself at the split-second idea of making a run for it in such a poorly designed building. "Take a seat and wait for a while. The detective will be in to speak with you shortly," said Morgan. Wade sat in the seat furthest from the door and set his shackled hands on the table. Looking up, he noticed an old CCTV camera on the ceiling pointed at him. The red dot underneath the lens was blinking repeatedly. Morgan exited the room, and Wade took a breath. Game over. He should have ended things when he had the chance. But then again, would she still be alive? He didn't even have a chance to catch her name. It was a shame, really. She was the first girl he had really interacted with in any way since how long it had been? Regardless, she was in trouble, and he had helped her. It was a different feeling, being the hero. Not good, but somehow different. The first time he had been arrested, Wade was guilty. He was the criminal. He deserved every bit of what he got, but this time was different. This time, he was justified. This time, he was the good guy. At least, he thought he was. Wade stared down at his bound hands, which he was restlessly tapping on the table in beat with the camera's small red dot. A buzzer sounded, and the detective walked in. He was about an inch or so taller than Wade, which wasn't saying very much. He was dressed in a white button-up shirt and cliché business slacks, carrying a file. His shoulder holster was empty, but Wade managed to catch a glimpse of the detective's shining gold police shield, which bore in large lettering the words Senior Detective. "Well, looks like we've both had quite a morning," the detective said. "I'm Detective Dan Palmer, by the way." Wade remained silent, and Palmer took a seat in the opposite chair, setting his folder on the table. He opened it up and skimmed through it for a few moments. "Just been reading through your file," he said. "Quite a jacket for 18 years old." Wade stared down at the table, not making eye contact. Palmer flipped through the folder some more, reading top to bottom several documents. "Charlie Wade, released from juvenile detention just yesterday on good behavior," he paraphrased aloud. "You had 3 more years on your sentence, but the parole board decided you were doing well enough to be released back into society ahead of schedule, albeit on probation." Wade swallowed. In his heart, he already knew the answer, but the question still remained. Would he be sent back? Palmer shut the folder gently and looked up at Wade to speak. Let's make no mistake. According to what that girl says, you're the hero here. Wade looked up and locked eyes with Palmer. Had he just been thanked? There's no telling what that guy would have done if you hadn't intervened, Palmer continued. And in truth, I'm all but ready to call you the Good Samaritan if it weren't for the issue of you breaking your probation. You've had a warrant out for your arrest, and unfortunately doing a good deed doesn't wipe away every bad one. Sure seems to help highlight them, though, Wade returned bitterly. Wade and Palmer stared at each other. Look, I'm not the best when it comes to things like this, but there's nothing I can do, Palmer answered. There are rules we have to follow for the greater good. You broke probation, and you were involved in a crime. That breaks the terms of your early release agreement. Wade turned his attention back to his hands, the classic "it's not my problem" treatment. He'd dealt with it before, plenty of times. So what happens to me now? Wade asked. You're going to be transferred back to prison. You'll serve the remainder of your time until you're 21. You'll no longer be eligible for parole. Wade nodded, his heart sinking. That was it. No more free passes. It would be another 3 years. If he could even last that long. If he even wanted to. Look, Wade, I don't know exactly what's going on, but I look at you and I see a good kid, said Palmer. A kid that knows right from wrong. A kid that deserved another chance. And when you got it, you threw it away. How come? It was a fair question. Why had he thrown everything away? Why, instead of living on a leash of freedom, did he choose to simply end it all? Was he really that miserable? His life was indeed at a low point, but had he really hit rock bottom? After a while, Wade looked up and stared at the wall behind Palmer. Then he spoke. When you grow up like me, and you live the life that I lived, you don't have many friends. And when you get thrown in the pen, you've got no one. Wade felt tears coming, but held them back. And when you spend 3 years by yourself, waiting for that second chance, hoping and praying, and you finally get it, you can feel new. Wade's eyes burned. But when you get back home, you come back to where it all started, you realize that everyone else has left and moved on. You're just as alone in the big wide world as you were in that tiny little cell. You find yourself wanting everything to go back to the way it was before, even though before it was nothing but pain every day, because in truth, feeling pain. Wade refocused on Palmer, staring directly at him. It's better than feeling nothing. Palmer and Wade sat there, looking at each other for a few moments. Wade couldn't read Palmer's expression, and didn't know for sure what to say next. Finally, Palmer blinked, as if pulling himself out of a train of thought. I've got to go contact your supervisor and let him know that you're being transferred. Palmer got up from the table, making for the door. When? Wade asked. Tomorrow. Detective? Wade called. The question had been burning in him for several hours, and he had to know the answer. Palmer turned around. How is she? Palmer lifted an eyebrow, confused at the question. The girl, Wade clarified. How's she doing? Palmer closed the folder and tucked it under his arm as the buzzer sounded. Grateful, he answered, heading out the door. Chapter 10. As the door to the holding cells shut behind him, Palmer made his way to the lobby. To say that today had been a long day would have been quite the understatement. What was supposed to be a routine drug bust ended up becoming the biggest headache Palmer had dealt with in at least the past 6 months. He felt bad for the kid. The girl would have most likely ended up in the hospital or even dead if he hadn't come to her rescue, and now he was being sent to prison. Palmer had seen firsthand what a double-edged sword the legal system could be, but it didn't feel right letting a kid like that get cut down. Palmer reached the end of the hallway and stood in front of the door to the lobby. He could only imagine what kind of whirlwind was awaiting him from Franks. Deputy Commissioner Franks and he had butted heads on a continual basis. While it was true that Franks was technically his superior, Palmer had far more experience and skill, though Franks would never admit to it. Palmer had been enlisted at the Federal Bureau of Investigations, spending a good 5 years in service to the Department of Justice. He had been a special liaison with the Central Intelligence Agency and had lived in over 4 different countries. After a decade of service to his country, he had decided to retire from federal work and try his hand at being a detective. He had never forgotten his first day walking into an interview at the Munich Police Department. Franks had questioned him for over an hour about almost everything under the sun. Being an ambitious man himself, Franks just couldn't wrap his mind around Palmer's wish to essentially climb down the totem pole. Still, he had enlisted Palmer regardless, but Palmer never could quite shake the feeling that Franks saw him as a threat. Franks took great joy in reminding him on a daily basis who was in charge, and this had led to several rather heated discussions. To make matters worse, Palmer was facing his yearly performance review, run by none other than Franks himself, and if Palmer didn't perform well, he could risk losing his job. "How's he doing?" Franks asked as Palmer walked into the lobby. Morgan and Franks had been waiting for him to return from questioning. Palmer sighed, saying, "Kid's got a record. He's being transferred back to his parole site tomorrow." Franks furrowed his brow in a classic expression of frustration. "I was referring to our dealer, Detective Palmer," he said hotly. Palmer lifted his hand up and rubbed his head. "Right, him. The real issue." "Oh, sorry," Palmer apologized. "He's in custody, facing 3 to 5. His hearing's in a week." Frank snatched the files out of Palmer's hand. "Well, that is wonderful," he quipped, lifting the folder up to Palmer's face. "And I hope you'll be there at the hearing to explain exactly why the Munich Police Department has to rely on innocent fugitive bystanders in order to catch its drug dealers." "Look, the guy got away," Palmer fought back. "It wasn't the first time something like that had happened. It was a routine mistake, and we fixed it." Palmer knew he had no real excuse, and Franks clearly picked up on this. He opened up the file, lazily scribbled his signature, and tossed the folder back to Palmer. "Oh, Detective, keep in mind that your performance review is still ongoing," he said with a great deal of arrogance. Palmer took a breath, careful not to lose his cool, answering, "I'm fully aware of that, sir, and believe me, I'll make sure that nothing like this ever happens again." "I certainly hope it doesn't, Detective Palmer," Frank said, leaving the lobby and heading toward his office. Finally able to let out some steam, Palmer stepped over to his filing cabinet, opened it up, placed the file in its proper place, and slammed it shut roughly. Morgan turned a blind eye and made for his desk, which was located directly behind Palmer's. "Thanks for running point back there," Palmer called to him. Morgan sat in his chair and leaned back, making eye contact with him. "Hey, listen, Dan, don't let him get to you. I'm sure the review will—" I know. It'll go just fine," Palmer finished for him, taking a seat at his own work area. "Still doesn't change the fact that he's right, though," Palmer continued. "I messed up. It was a rookie mistake, and it put a lot of people at risk. It was stupid of me to let things get that far out of hand, and I deserve the punishment that Franks will inevitably reward me with." Morgan gave him a slap on the shoulder, trying to cheer him up. "Hey, let me take you out for a drink tonight." Palmer shook his head. "Can't. Promised Sherry I'd be home for dinner." Morgan stacked a few papers together and shut the light off on his desk. "Suit yourself," he said, standing up to leave. "Have a good night." "You too, Morgan," Palmer responded as he headed out the door. Palmer was left to himself, giving him some much-needed quiet to think about the day. Morgan was a good cop. Palmer had first started working with him around 8 months ago. He was picking up the work routine faster than Palmer himself had. He was the best driver on the force, and he knew how to handle himself in the field. Palmer had regularly been impressed with how cool Morgan managed to stay throughout the day. He never got into an argument, and he seemed to always know how to keep everyone calm and situations under control. Would Morgan have made the same mistake he did? Somehow Palmer knew in his heart that Morgan would have checked the wire. Double-checked, in fact. Morgan was a perfectionist, and he always made sure that everything was in working order. He was the kind of guy who would wake up every morning to clean and check his firearm to see if everything was in above-satisfactory conditions. Palmer then thought about himself. Was he that committed? That much of a perfectionist? Did he show as much care and concern for his job? Was he getting lazy? There had to be some explanation as to why he had slipped up so many times in a rather simple procedure. He had done far more complicated and far more dangerous things in his past while working in the field. What was the reason for his sudden drop in proficiency? Was he getting too old? The thought of retirement hadn't even occurred to him before. Palmer rubbed his forehead and let out a yawn. He was just having a bad day. Everyone did, every now and then. He just needed to get home and unwind. Sherry would be able to cheer him up. And the thought of a long night's rest wasn't that bad either. Palmer switched off his computer and turned off the desk lamp. He stood up, packed his things, and clocked out. Heading out to the parking lot, the feeling of the early evening wind calmed his nerves, and he took a deep breath. He would put the thoughts of the drug bust, of Franks, and Wade aside for now. He could tackle all of those issues in the morning. The thoughts of family, dinner, and sleep filled his mind, and Palmer walked up to his car, eager to face them. Chapter 11. Wade sat on the ground of his small cell in Munich, staring up at the ceiling. Tomorrow he'd be transferred back to New York, and quite a great deal of punishment would be waiting for him. Wade turned himself around and lay on his back. The cold ground of his cell pushed against his body and made it feel like he was laying on ice. Wade rubbed his side. Felt like he had cracked a rib, but he wasn't going to let the police know it. He needed the pain. Cuts and bruises on his face, chest, and back made him feel alive. He had helped someone. He had seen a problem and he had fixed it. And for some reason, being part of the solution made him feel as if he was worth something again. He had tried to end it all, but Wade was starting to see things differently. There were still things that he could do. There were still people out there who needed help, and for today, he had managed to help one of them. Could he have found a reason to be free? "I'm home." Palmer walked through the front door of his single-story home and hung his jacket up. His house was the kind that was always unspeakably clean, with fresh flowers decorating almost every room. His wife Sherry liked it that way, and had made it a rule to make sure everything was as tidy as possible throughout the day. She walked into the front room and greeted him with a kiss on the cheek. "How was work, honey?" Palmer loosened his tie and unbuttoned the upper section of his shirt. "No worse than usual," he said without a hint of worry traceable. "Yours?" "Just peachy," Sherry said, smiling. "Peachy, huh? Well, I like the sound of that," Palmer answered, chuckling to himself. Palmer walked into the living room and looked around. The TV, as usual, was turned on with the volume going full blast, and his son Colin sat playing a video game. "Colin, how was school?" Palmer shouted over the television. Colin put a hand through his thick blonde hair in an attempt to imitate his mother. "Just peachy," he answered sarcastically. Palmer looked at his son in amusement. He turned to his wife, pointing at the television. "How long has he been in front of that thing today?" he asked. "About an hour," Sherry responded, giving a small smile. "Yeah, an hour my foot," Palmer said, making his way toward the kitchen. "He knows he's got you to cover for him." "What are mothers for?" Yeah, Palmer mumbled, heading to the kitchen counter. "We get anything in the mail?" "Just bills." "Let's see," Palmer said to himself, picking up the stack of letters and skimming through it. He pulled out the electrical bill and tore it open. "Whoa!" Palmer craned his head around the doorway and called to his son in the living room. "Colin, buddy, turn that thing off before you bankrupt us," he said. "That'll be the day," Colin responded as he continued playing. "I'm serious, kiddo. This bill is through the roof. Why not turn off half those computers you got running upstairs and save us a few trips to the soup kitchen?" "I'm on it," Colin answered as he sat doing absolutely nothing. Palmer furrowed his brow and looked back at the bill. He would never admit it to Sherry or Colin, but things weren't exactly easy to pay for. More and more recently, he had been pulling in overtime shifts at the station to cover the cost of the house. He didn't know for sure how much longer he'd be able to hold everything together. Ironically, his line of work was one of the lowest paying around, yet Palmer never felt like he fit anywhere else. He had tried different jobs, sure, but he always found himself returning to what he did best. He was in his element when fighting crime, and he had learned a long time ago that just because one excels at something doesn't mean they'll always be rewarded handsomely for it. Sherry walked up behind him and began to rub his back gently. "What is it, honey?" she asked, concerned. He never could hide his thoughts from her. "Oh, it's nothing," he answered. "Dan, tell me." All right. I messed up in the field today during a performance review. I almost let a guy get away. It was a stupid mistake, and I can't seem to shake it off." Sherry looked at him. "Should I be worried?" she questioned. Palmer shook his head. "What? No, of course not. Don't worry about it." He turned his attention to the dining room table. "Fixed dinner?" "Your favorite," she smiled. "Dark chocolate?" "Steak." "Even better," he said, kissing her on the cheek. "Excuse me, there's a minor in the house," Colin shouted from the living room. Palmer shrugged him off and looked at his wife. "I'm gonna go hop in the shower and get the smell of convicts off me, okay?" "Sounds like a plan." Palmer headed towards his bedroom, messing with Colin's hair as he walked by. "Not necessary," Colin said. "Neither is the game," Palmer said playfully. "Go help your mom with the table." Things were starting to look up, and more importantly, he had just thought up a solution to the problem that was nagging at him. Chapter 12. Harmony sat in her daycare room the next morning, acting as if everything was normal. On the outside, she tried her best to seem as natural as possible for the kids, but on the inside, she was screaming. She had almost died yesterday. She would have been in a body bag if it weren't for the help of a guy that was now sitting in a jail cell. It wasn't fair. She didn't even get to know his name. The police had come to scoop her up after he had done all the dirty work for them. He had put his own life at risk. That was bothering Harmony the most out of everything. The guy had never met her, and she had never met him, yet he was willing to run headfirst towards the barrel of a gun for her? Who was he? And more importantly, who was she that she deserved such a protector? Harmony looked at the clock. In an hour, she would be able to get off of work, and she would go directly to the police station to get all of her questions answered. Harmony hoped that she could find some type of closure to the whole mess and put it behind her. Despite every suggestion of her conscience, she hadn't told anyone what had happened yesterday. The police had kept the events to themselves, and she hadn't shared the episode with anyone else, not even her parents. It had been a strange feeling coming home and keeping it all a secret. She knew she would eventually have to tell them, but they didn't need all of the added worry just yet. Harmony. She looked up from the group of kids and saw a coworker standing in the doorway looking concerned. Yes, Harmony answered cautiously. Mrs. Fredericks needs to see you. Mrs. Fredericks was the sole owner of the daycare and was quite the character. She reminded Harmony of an exceptionally mean math teacher she had studied under in 3rd grade. As a boss, she was almost impossible to get along with, and she always had a negative comment or critique that she wouldn't shy away from sharing. If ever there was a reason to leave the daycare and find another job, the existence of Mrs. Fredericks would have been it. But, needing the money, Harmony stuck with it as best she could. Harmony looked to her coworker and motioned to the group of kids. Mind watching them while I'm gone? Of course. Harmony turned to the group of children and smiled as politely as she could. Kids, I'll be right back, okay? Okay, Miss Wallace, they all returned. Harmony got up and made her way to Mrs. Frederick's office, fully expecting bad news. Mrs. Frederick's office was your classic school teacher of terror workroom. It reminded Harmony of the principal's office that she sat in with her mother and father in the 1st grade when she had gotten in trouble for kissing a boy she had liked on the playground during recess. It had that distinct feel of curriculum. It let off the type of aura that the only people who ever went inside had come back out with no happiness left in their souls. Harmony knocked on the door quietly. "Come in," said a voice from inside. She slowly opened the door and stepped in. Mrs. Fredericks was sitting behind her very large desk, writing on a legal pad and looking through several books. She wore a set of thin, half-moon glasses and was donning a striking color of cherry red lipstick. Her appearance was almost comical, and had Harmony's anticipation not been so dire, she might have laughed. "I was told you wanted to see me, Mrs. Fredericks?" "Yes, Harmony, please have a seat," she replied, gesturing to the seat facing her. Harmony entered the room fully and sat quietly at the opposite side of the desk, trying to look as comfortable and natural as possible. Mrs. Fredericks continued to write on her legal pad for a few moments, and then finally moved it aside. She slowly leaned back in her chair and placed her pen inside of her desk. Harmony swallowed. "The police station phoned here a while ago and told me what happened," Mrs. Fredericks finally spoke. It was as Harmony feared. She had been a fool to think that the police department would remain completely silent about what had happened. It was nothing," said Harmony. "I would have mentioned it, but everything had already gotten worked out. I figured it didn't really matter that much." Mrs. Fredericks looked past Harmony to examine the wall with a completely blank stare. "Well, it doesn't. And yet, it does." Harmony blinked at her, confused. "I'm not quite sure I know what you mean, Mrs. Fredericks." Mrs. Fredericks focused her eyes back on Harmony, giving her that classic stare she was known for, like she could see through any lie that you threw her way. "Harmony," she said, "you are currently enrolled in college, trying to get into the medical field, correct?" "Yes, ma'am," Harmony nodded. Mrs. Fredericks immediately kept talking. "And yet, you are currently employed not only here, but also at a restaurant on 3rd Street as well?" "Yes, ma'am." Harmony's heart sank. She had worked so hard to make sure she kept her second job under wraps, and yet Mrs. Fredericks still managed to find out about it. "I see. And in what class that you're enrolled in did they teach you that you'd be able to manage 2 full-time jobs and a full-time college career?" Mrs. Fredericks' voice was harsher this time. Harmony put her best face on. I'm only doing it all for just a little while longer. I'm just trying to get some extra money to help support my family. Mrs. Fredericks folded her arms and shook her head in a manner that showed she wasn't buying it. Harmony, I know your mother and your father, and I know for a fact that their lives are not dependent on your current income. So I'll ask you again, why choose to juggle so many different responsibilities? Harmony looked down at her lap. She couldn't keep eye contact without stumbling over her words. I'm trying to get enough money to get an apartment. Mrs. Fredericks continued her hard look, still not satisfied with Harmony's answer. Harmony, it's far from my position to know what you need to work so hard for, but it is, unfortunately, affecting your performance here. And I'm sure at the restaurant and your schoolwork as well. Harmony looked up and locked eyes with her. Something has to give, Mrs. Fredericks stated, and unfortunately, it's going to have to be this job. Harmony looked away, trying to control her emotions. Am I fired? Mrs. Fredericks leaned forward in her chair. I'm putting it on record that you gave me your 2 weeks' notice. Harmony held back her tears. I understand. Mrs. Fredericks unfolded her arms and beckoned towards her. Harmony, you're a wonderful young woman with a bright future, and I'm not going to let you jeopardize it by overloading yourself with too many things. Do yourself a favor, come back to work when you've got a little more room on your plate, and we can try and work something out. Harmony nodded. You can pick up your check at the front office, Mrs. Fredericks said, returning her attention to her desk. Harmony slowly got up from the chair and headed towards the door. Harmony, Mrs. Fredericks called. Yes? Mrs. Fredericks lowered her glasses and looked at Harmony with a stare that was difficult to read. Tell your parents I said hi. Pedaling as fast as she could towards the police station, Harmony had finally managed to pull herself together. Between her mass amount of schoolwork, being attacked, and losing her job, she wasn't quite sure how much more she could take. She needed good news, and she hoped that she'd be able to get some when she arrived at her destination. She needed to find out what had happened to him. Despite her cries against it, they had thrown him into the back of the police cruiser and sent him to the station like a common criminal. Harmony hoped that the police had finally sorted things out after she had given them her statement. She had assured them that he was her rescuer, and Harmony wondered if they had released him yet. Who was he? Judging from the limited time she had been with him, Harmony figured he was about the same age as her. She hadn't seen him in class, and she certainly hadn't seen him around town beforehand. Did he live somewhere else? Maybe he had family in Munich that he was visiting on vacation. Whatever the case, Harmony needed to know who he was. She needed to thank him. She needed to ask him the question that had been running around her head all morning. Why? Why had he saved her? Why risk his own life? Why had he been so brave? Harmony cautiously walked into the Munich police station and looked around. Several people were at work typing on computers and filling out reports. She scanned the station and crossed into the main workroom. He had to be here somewhere. Finally, she spotted him. Leaning against his desk with his arms crossed, talking on the phone, was Detective Dan Palmer. He had been the one to debrief her yesterday. He had been very kind and promised that he would make sure everything turned out all right. Harmony had asked him to keep the attack to the confines of the station, and he had agreed, but Harmony now wondered if he had broken his promise and called the daycare on purpose. She walked up behind him as he spoke into the phone and tapped his foot at the same time. Yes, I understand you're having problems securing the permit, but the law requires you to have one by next month or you can't legally own it. Detective Palmer? She asked. He spun around and looked at Harmony. He smiled, held up his finger, and continued speaking to the other person on the line. Yes, you need to contact the manufacturer then and find out what they can do about it. All right, have a nice day. He hung up the phone and looked over at her while checking off a name on a list. Yes? Harmony straightened herself. I'm Harmony Wallace, from yesterday? Yes, of course. How can I help you, Miss Wallace? He said, turning his attention fully to her. His voice was very calm and well-mannered. Well, actually, I was wondering how the guy that saved me was doing. Harmony looked at Palmer with keen interest. His answer to the question would decide how the rest of her day would be. Palmer took a breath, which signaled to Harmony the news wasn't going to be good. Wade? Well, Wade was on probation for a previous offense, and he wasn't allowed to leave his state, so he's been arrested, and he's being sent back. Harmony looked at him confused. Arrested? But he helped. I know how it sounds, he interrupted. And believe me, I don't like it any more than you do, but it's how the law works. He might have been a hero yesterday, but he's still a criminal according to the rules. How is he a criminal? Harmony had spent the whole night thinking he was innocent, and it turned out that he was on the run from the law? She didn't believe it. He had saved her. There was no possible way he could be grouped in with the same lowlife that had tried to hurt her. There must have been a mistake. Even if he did have a criminal record, he helped her. He should have been cleared of all charges. That doesn't seem fair, Harmony charged. Palmer nodded, adding, I feel exactly the same way, Miss Wallace. Harmony took a step toward him. Well, there must be something that you can do. Palmer looked off to the side for a moment as if in deep thought. I'm afraid there really isn't, and it's quite a shame, he finally spoke. Harmony didn't buy it. Palmer had been the one to arrest Wade, and now there suddenly was nothing he could do to help him? What good was the law if it was constantly putting people like Wade in prison? Harmony didn't know what he was guilty of, or what he had been running from, but she was certain of one thing. A person who would risk their life to help save another didn't belong behind bars. She looked around the station as if trying to find some form of support. She had to do something. Wade had helped to save her, and she needed to return the favor. She had to ask him. She had to see him. Where is he now? She asked. Palmer motioned towards a hallway off to the side of the station. He's in holding. How long is he staying there? Palmer checked a folder that he already had open on his desk. He's going to be transferred in a few hours, he responded, checking his watch, adding, I'm sorry. Palmer turned back to his desk and picked up the phone, going back to work. Harmony turned to leave. It couldn't be over. There had to be something she could do. She turned back around to Palmer, who was dialing on the phone. Could I talk to him? She finally asked. Palmer looked up from his desk. I'm sorry? He responded questioningly. Harmony looked down at her shoes, saying, It's just, I never even got a chance to say thank you. She sensed Palmer's hesitation, adding, It would only be for a moment. I would feel bad if I didn't tell him how much I appreciated what he did for me. Please? Palmer opened his mouth and looked around the office quietly, contemplating. Harmony continued to stare at him as seriously as possible. All right, he finally said, caving in. He stepped away from his desk, pulled out a key from his pocket, and nodded for her to follow him. Harmony walked along behind him, preparing herself as best she could. The buzzer to the questioning room sounded, and Harmony stepped in through the door. As it shut behind her, she saw him sitting, chained to the table, in full prison fatigues. He looked completely exhausted. His hair was greasy and unkempt, and the bags underneath his eyes gave the impression that he hadn't slept in some time. He blinked a few times as if waking up from a trance and looked at her, confused. Harmony took a few steps toward him and stopped. This is, she began, not seeming able to find any words. She looked down at herself and tried to act calm. This is kind of weird for me. I'm sorry. He stared at her intently. I heard that Harmony stumbled over her words again. Why was she finding it so difficult to talk? I heard that you were leaving, and I just wanted to say thank you for saving me. She knew the words sounded empty from the moment they left her mouth. Here she was, apologizing and acting like everything was all right. They both knew it wasn't. He stared at her a moment, and then nodded. You're welcome, he returned. This was unfair, and Harmony knew it. She felt terrible. Why was she standing there, getting off scot-free while the real hero was getting left to the sharks? What was she even doing here? Saying thanks? See you in prison? Harmony stared at her feet. Just get it over with, let him know you're thankful, and move on. That's all you can do. She took a step forward, extending her hand. A handshake might have been goofy, but it was the only thing she could think of to get the point across. He held up his hand as if to stop her, and the sound of his arms reaching to the end of the chain filled the room. Right, Harmony thought. Handcuffs. The shake could have been thought out better. Harmony withdrew her hand, and he leaned back, letting out a soft laugh. Thank you, he said quietly. What for? Harmony replied, confused. He stared at her for a moment, shook himself, and smiled. For coming by and everything. Harmony nodded. No problem. She heard the buzzer sound, and Harmony turned to leave. Was that really it? She turned to look at him once more. I'm Harmony, by the way, she said quickly. Wade. It's very nice to meet you, Wade. Same, he said roughly, nodding. After one more moment of looking at each other, Harmony walked out of the room and was led back to the main lobby by Detective Palmer. Chapter 13. Wade sat chained to his seat in the prisoner transfer vehicle and stared out the window. As he looked out across the open fields, he couldn't help but yearn to be outside, walking through them and listening to the sounds of the countryside. You never quite appreciate your surroundings until you learn they're about to be taken away, Wade thought to himself as he leaned his forehead against the window. He had only been in Munich for a short time, but having it all taken away from him so suddenly felt cheap and seemed cruel. Harmony. The name had been played through his head almost 1,000,000 times, as had their conversation. Wade didn't know exactly what to think. He had spent over 900 days in prison and hadn't received a single visitor, and yet, just a few hours after finding himself behind bars again, a girl he didn't even know had taken time out of her day to check up on him. She had been more of a friend to him than anyone else, and most importantly, she thanked him. While the bullet was meant to be a catalyst for Wade receiving some amount of peace, being thanked had done that and more. He had made a difference in the world. He had changed something. The world was, for all intents and purposes, a small amount better because of his actions. Could he have found what he felt was missing? Could this have been what he was waiting for? Could he have found a reason to live? A motive to stay alive? Perhaps suicide hadn't been the answer that he was looking for, but just an easy way out. Did the answer really lie in such a small town? One thing was for sure, he didn't want to die anymore. His mind was active again, and he knew he had managed to stumble upon something that could end up turning his entire life around. Palmer dried his hands off with a paper towel. He stared at his reflection in the men's room mirror of the police station, trying to find an answer, the words of Harmony echoing throughout his consciousness. There must be something that you can do. Was there? Palmer had thought about the question all afternoon. He couldn't stand to see a kid like Wade sent off to prison, even with his past record. Something about him just clicked with Palmer. It was as if Palmer saw a bit of himself in Wade. He understood where he was coming from. Palmer had looked over his file, and without question, he had seen and lived through an unbelievable amount of hardships. The kid had been through more than some people ever experience in their entire lives, and he wasn't even in his 20s. It might have been that Palmer had felt bad for him, or that he agreed with Wade about the unfairness that the law often allowed for, but for whatever reason, Palmer couldn't shake the feeling that he was still somehow able to help him. He had thought long and hard, and had finally come up with an idea. It was a 1 in a million shot, but it would be better than doing nothing. Palmer had worked overseas with an agent who hailed from Boston. He had always talked to Palmer about retiring from foreign work and returning to America to head up field operations with the NYPD. Palmer hadn't spoken to him in 1.5 years, and had no idea if the man's vision had ever come to reality, but it was worth a shot. He didn't have his phone number, but Palmer figured if he spent enough time on the phone with his old co-workers from the Bureau, he'd be able to track the man down. Was it guilt that was fueling him? The fact that he had been the one to arrest Wade? To discover the kid's warrant and place him in custody? If he hadn't run the routine background check, Wade could have gone on his way and no one would have been the wiser. He would still have a shot at the new chance he had been wanting. Could the cause of all of Palmer's stress simply be that he had taken Wade's chance away? He didn't know for sure, and Palmer reckoned that he would never be able to answer the conundrum fully, but it all boiled down to one question. Could he fix things? Palmer walked back to his desk silently and sat down, opening up a small black folder that he kept in the very back of his desk. He picked up his phone and punched the number 9 to get an outside line. It was now or never. Palmer found the number he was looking for in the folder and punched in the first digit. "Welcome back, Mr. Wade." Wade was sat down onto his chair in the questioning room and took a breath. He was finally back in New York, and just as expected, a monster of a headache was awaiting him. He sat across from his parole counselor, Officer McDaniels. It hadn't been very long at all since Wade had last spoken to him on the phone and made the promise not to get himself into any trouble. Things hadn't quite worked out so well after that phone call, and Wade knew he was going to catch an unimaginable amount of heat. Wade remained silent as McDaniels looked him over. He was flipping through Wade's tattered file, sighing heavily. "It's just strange to me," he began. Wade swallowed. "Why someone would spend 3 years of their life acting as upright as you did to get let out early if their only intention was to get sent back as soon as possible." The officer's voice was cold and stiff. "Wasn't exactly my intention," Wade said coolly. He had had enough of people criticizing him. He was going to take this opportunity to fight back, no matter how futile it would be. "Your conduct says otherwise," McDaniels started. "My conduct?" Wade shot back. "I saved a girl from getting shot." "You skipped parole the very same day you were released," McDaniels broke in, his voice becoming harsher with each syllable. "You broke the law. You somehow have managed to lose all of the paperwork sent to you, but that doesn't really matter anymore, since you're going right back to your cell." Wade stood his ground. "Somehow saving a life seems to mean a lot more to me than it does to anyone else," he said defiantly. "The fact that you broke the law in order to get into that position to begin with makes your actions, no matter how heroic, null and void," McDaniels shouted. He threw Wade's file onto the table. "You're 18 years old, you got no ambitions, no plan, no discipline, and most importantly, no respect for the law. And those 4 things mean a lot in my book." Wade threw his chained hands into the air. "What'd you expect me to do?" he yelled back. "You stuffed me in some shoddy apartment somewhere downtown that I ended up getting robbed at, allegedly. You expect me to return to society with next to no money, no belongings but the clothes on my back, no help, no support but a job at a factory I probably would have been fired from regardless. Look, I get it. You got dealt a bad hand, but that's too bad because a lot of us are," McDaniels answered, adding, "You're not sitting in front of me because of your lack of help. You're here because you threw what help you had aside, broke the rules, and crossed state lines. Don't expect me to feel too much sympathy." "Oh, come on," Wade responded. "I cross state lines and I get treated like I killed a guy. I wonder why that is." Silence filled the room. Wade broke his stare with McDaniels and looked down at the table. "Wade, you have any goals? Any dreams? Any idea of what you want to do with your life?" McDaniels asked pointedly. Wade gave a half-hearted and quiet laugh to himself. "Actually, I do." McDaniels set his hands on the table and watched Wade intently. "Share it with me." "I want to help people." "Help people." Wade moved uncomfortably in his seat. I want to fix problems. I want to rescue people in trouble." Officer McDaniels eyed him carefully, clarifying, "You mean you want to be a hero?" Wade shook his head roughly. "No, I just want to be the good guy. But it seems like after doing that, I'm being treated like a bad guy." Officer McDaniels and Wade stared at each other. Wade put it all on the table. He had presented the reason he found, his new calling, his purpose. But it was beginning to look like he wouldn't be able to fulfill it. Palmer stood on the front porch of the Wallace residence and rang the doorbell. He straightened his suit jacket and took a step back, trying to put on his best smile. He would need all the help he could to pull this thing off, and Harmony Wallace was the biggest piece of the puzzle. None of it would work without her support. Palmer just hoped she would be up for it. After a few moments, the front door unlocked, and Palmer came face to face with Harmony. "Detective?" Harmony's face seemed as if it was instantly drained of all color. Palmer looked at her, trying to be as friendly as he could given the circumstance. "Mind if I speak to you for a minute?" he asked. Harmony took a step outside when a voice came from her end of the doorway. "Harmony, honey, who is it?" Harmony shot a look inside, worried. Palmer held up his hand. "5 minutes," he said quickly. She didn't have much time to respond to him because immediately an elderly woman appeared in the doorway. "May I help you?" she asked suspiciously. Palmer placed a hand on his front pocket and pulled out his badge. "Yes, ma'am. I'm Detective Dan Palmer with the Munich Police Department. I was wondering if I could speak with Miss Wallace." Palmer saw Harmony open her mouth to protest, but her mother quickly smiled. "Well, yes, of course. Come on in." Palmer entered the house and followed Mrs. Wallace toward the residence's living room, where an elderly man sat in a wheelchair. The man turned to look at him. "Dan?" he heard the man say quietly. Dan Palmer? Palmer halfway didn't believe it. He looked at the man doing a double take. Mr. Wallace? He asked his old school teacher. Mr. Wallace chuckled lightly and moved towards him. My goodness, boy, come on in, he said brightly. Harmony looked over at Palmer, confused. You two know each other? She asked. Palmer smiled. Mr. Wallace was a professor of mine in high school. Of course, Wallace. Why didn't I make the connection? Palmer turned to Harmony. Of course, you'd be his daughter. Palmer watched as his former English teacher inched towards him in a wheelchair. Well, you've certainly become quite a man, Mr. Wallace chuckled. Detective, you say? Yes, sir, Palmer nodded. Mr. Wallace laughed to himself. I always knew you'd do well, Dan. So, is my daughter in any sort of trouble? Palmer looked over to Harmony, who stared back at him with the type of expression that could only mean he doesn't know. No, sir, Palmer lied. I actually just needed some information from her concerning the daycare she works at. We've had some calls, and I'm just seeing if she knows anything that I need to. Mr. Wallace studied Palmer for a quick moment. I see. Well, have at it, he said. Join us for lunch. Palmer held up his hand, saying, I'd rather not. I need to get back to the station as soon as possible. Rain check? If you're sure. With a quick goodbye, Palmer headed out the front door with Harmony in tow. He turned around to face her, looking at her seriously. You haven't told them what happened, have you? He charged, concerned. Harmony waved him off, saying, I've got everything under control. Why are you here? Palmer took a moment to get his thoughts together. Are you still interested in helping Wade? He asked. Palmer was surprised at how quickly her expression changed from pure frustration to pure curiosity. Well, yeah, I am. How? Palmer looked at her. I pulled a few strings and called in some favors and managed to get the parole board that sentenced Wade together for a short hearing. If you testify that Wade saved you and was acting in the interest of the public good, then we might be able to get his sentence shortened. Testify? Harmony asked, unsure of herself. Palmer put his hands up to try and reassure her. It'll just be a room of board members, nothing too big. I can prep you on how to give your statement, what things you should say, what things you should leave out. They might ask to question you, but we can run through that as well. Would you be willing to? Palmer held his breath, awaiting the moment of truth. Surprisingly, Harmony nodded. Of course. When do we start? Palmer smiled. I'll give you a call later today about it, okay? Harmony nodded as he began to leave. Okay. Thanks, Detective. Palmer gave her a quick wave and headed towards his police cruiser. Have a good afternoon, he called. Harmony returned his wave and walked back into her house, smiling. Palmer turned the key in the ignition and pulled out as quickly as he could. The hard part was over, and everything had gone far smoother than he had originally predicted, but it wasn't over yet. He would need to hurry to make sure everything else went according to plan. Chapter 14. Harmony sat with Detective Palmer in front of the large group of board members in New York City. Her first time out of state had been quite underwhelming, to say the least. She had spent the entire time in transit with Palmer and had spoken very little to him. She wasn't allowed to go anywhere, and she needed to be near him at all times. She didn't mind it too much, however. It wasn't like this was a vacation. Her only purpose for being in the city was to help Wade, and it had taken quite a stretch of the imagination to sell her parents on the idea that she would be gone for 2 whole days. As hectic as the traveling had been, the big moment was even scarier for her. The detective had run her through the entire process several times over, but it was different in front of such an important group of people. At first glance, they didn't seem all that thrilled to see her, or the detective, and it finally dawned on Harmony that it was this group of people that had put Wade in jail in the first place. She could reasonably understand that they would all be upset about having to go to work on a weekend just to hear her talk in a shy voice about what had happened. Palmer had been amazing for her to watch. She was shocked at how professional and eloquent he presented himself, as if he had been through this routine plenty of times before. He spoke with a strong voice and left little room for argument in the things that he said. When the floor was finally given to her, she leaned up to the microphone and hesitantly made eye contact with them. Her nerves were starting to get the best of her, but she told herself to relax and remember the purpose of her being there. She was in the room to help save Wade, just as he had saved her. He had put his life on the line for her. The least she could do was tell her story. She gave one last look to Palmer, who nodded to her, smiling, and then she turned to speak. Why were prison cells always the same color? Wade had been to more than one prison in his lifetime, and for some reason, each time he was placed into a cell, the wall was always painted the same boring color. Was there a manual out there for how to build monotonous prisons, or was it just the cheapest paint on the market? He lay on his bunk and sat up to look outside his cell's barred window at the prison's workyard. His prison status was listed as processing, technically, and younger adults were kept out of general population for their first month at the state pen. In other words, he had about 30 days of safety before being forced to dive headfirst into true prison life. He wasn't in juvie anymore. The chances of murder, rape, and abuse were much higher here, and it was only a matter of time before he would be thrown into the middle of it. Wade dug in his pocket and pulled out the one item they had allowed him to keep, the small black leather notebook he had picked up in Munich. He opened it up to the first page and took out his small prison-issued writing pencil. He placed the lead on the page, looked up to the ceiling. He quickly scribbled the one word that he couldn't get out of his head. Harmony. He heard a buzzer, and the door to his cell slid open. A security guard stepped up to the doorway and looked in. "Got a visitor, Wade." Wade picked himself up off of the bed. Who on earth would want to see him? Did anyone even know he had been transferred to prison? "Any idea who it is?" Wade asked. The guard simply shook his head and motioned for Wade to follow him. Wade rose to his feet in bewilderment and was escorted out. Wade sat restlessly in his chair in the middle of the visitation room looking around. The entire area was empty, save for a few guards, which was highly unusual. He had toyed with the idea that she had come to visit him, but he quickly cut off the train of thought, not wanting to be disappointed. Chances were that it was McDaniels, wanting to tear off another strip in front of him yet again. Wade honestly didn't know how much more he could take. Going to prison was hard enough. He didn't need a lecture about it every 2 hours. The door to the visiting room opened, and Wade turned his attention to the man entering. There, wearing a full suit and tie, with a bright smile on his face, was the detective that had arrested him. Wade half wanted to jump up and kick him in the chest, but he held back his anger toward the man that had taken him out of society. "Detective," Wade said loosely, trying to keep himself calm. "Palmer," the man finished. "It's kind of hard to remember." "What are you doing here?" Wade spoke, cutting him off sharply, adding, "New York's a little outside of your district." Palmer held his hand up as if trying to make peace. "Oh, I'm not anywhere near my jurisdiction to be a threat to you." Palmer took a seat, and Wade sighed heavily. He wanted to go back to his cell. The only thing worse than having to listen to McDaniels was listening to the man that had sent Wade back to the confines of prison. "What do you want?" Wade said, signaling Palmer to get to the point. Palmer looked at him and smiled. "I'm just dropping by to tell you that we managed to get your sentence reduced to a week." Wade's brain stopped in its tracks. "A week? How?" "Harmony and I testified before the parole board at a hearing." Wade looked at Palmer. "Harmony was here?" Palmer continued speaking. "They came to the conclusion that your active civil service was enough to kick out your parole violation, and they're prepared to give you another chance at recidivism." They were letting him go? Wade almost didn't believe it. He had been facing 3 more years of time, and yet because of a single hearing, it was dropped to a week? "So, what happens to me now?" Wade asked. Palmer leaned back in his chair quite comfortably. "Presumably, you'll be released back to where they first sent you, except you're not going to be getting any free passes next time around." Wade stared up in disbelief. Was he really going to get another chance? "Thank you," he told Palmer. "Hey, don't thank me, thank yourself," Palmer began. He leaned forward and locked eyes with Wade. "But understand this, risking your life as a free man by skipping parole, of all things, is stupid. Don't do it. You don't have to keep living in pain. There are people out there, millions of them, that have it worse than you do. You're blessed, no matter how bad things may look sometimes, no matter how alone you may feel. You want to start feeling something besides pain? You start living. You start making your life mean something. Find something to live for and live for it. Because everything else, it's just scenery flying by." Wade looked into Palmer's eyes and understood. They were connected. They had both lived in pain. They both had their doubts. But Palmer had somehow found a way out, and now he was trying to be the guiding light for Wade. Could Wade have given Palmer too tough of a break? Wade nodded at him. Palmer returned in kind and stood up. As he made his way towards the room's exit, Wade couldn't help but smile. It seemed that things were beginning to look up. Chapter 15. Wade walked out of the front entrance a week later and rubbed his wrist gently. He hoped that would be the last time he would wear handcuffs. He turned back around and took a last glimpse at the outer walls of the prison, promising himself he would never be back. Things had changed since his last time outside. At first, he had felt as if he had nothing to live for, nothing to spend his time achieving, nothing to make him happy or at peace. Things were different now. Palmer had convinced him that he could change. He could keep living. Wade turned towards the city street and began walking towards his waiting cab. He had surrendered himself to the fact that he had nothing tangible to live for, but he didn't care, because for Wade, life wasn't about finding pleasure and peace. He had decided that even though he could never make himself fully happy, he could spend his life committed to making sure others were. Even though he would walk through the earth yearning hopelessly for some type of total satisfaction, he could do everything in his power to help the people that he met along the way. And for the moment, that would suffice. Harmony pedaled down the road, gaining more and more speed, flying by the people that she passed while turning onto her street. Looking up at the sky, she closed her eyes and let go of the bike's handlebars and lifted her arms up, outstretched. She continued pedaling down the empty road with the wind blowing against her face. If her encounter with Wade had taught her anything, it was that life was too short to waste by being unhappy. She was going to make sure that she spent every day doing things she enjoyed, and she wasn't going to let anyone keep her from accomplishing her goals. She would take life one day at a time, and be thankful for what it was worth, because she had learned all of it could be gone in an instant. She wasn't going to be unappreciative of her blessings any longer. She was setting her sights firmly on her dreams, and she wasn't going to slow down. She finally opened her eyes, set her grip back on the handlebars, and shot downhill. Palmer sat next to Morgan at the police station filing papers. He hadn't told anyone about the favor he had pulled for Wade, and he didn't intend on ever doing so. It wasn't for them to know. Palmer just hoped that Wade would take his advice and get on the right track. He would give his parole officer a call in a few months to check in. Meanwhile, he had other things to worry about. The hearing for the drug dealer was later that afternoon. Morgan and he had been up all night compiling everything they could about the crime. They had a solid case, and Palmer was confident that the crook would be facing serious jail time. Palmer lifted up Harmony's initial report, scanned it quickly, and placed it in the case's binder. Everything was starting to fall into place. His full performance review would be on Monday morning. Palmer knew that a lot more was in store for him, but he wasn't going to let that distract him. He would cross that bridge when he came to it. For now, he was going to finish his job. A lot of people had helped to bring the dealer in, and it was up to Palmer to make sure that their efforts weren't for nothing. He turned around to face Morgan and held up his coffee mug. They both toasted, smiling, and continued their work. Wade exited the taxi and began to walk down the street. First things first, he was going to get some new clothes. When prison fatigues were easily more comfortable than the clothes you wore in public, it was time to visit the general store. He could use some toothpaste, too, and deodorant wouldn't hurt either. As he crossed the street and turned the corner towards his apartment, he stopped dead in his tracks and looked up in awe. Thick smoke and flames stretched out into the sky where his apartment now sat in a pile of rubble. Fire crews were at the scene, all shouting at one another and spraying the walls of the destroyed building with large hoses. Fire trucks were backed up in droves next to the former building, doing their best to fend off the fury of the blaze. Wade looked disbelievingly at the wreckage. He had no words. Silently, he made a fist, stared down at the ground, looked back up to the apartment, and left. Yeah, that's it. If you've made it this far, I salute you, and you have my most sincere apologies. I don't know what you were expecting out of a book written by a teenager, but there you go. I promise you that the next book I publish will be far better. On a more serious note, thanks 500,000 subscribers seemed impossible, but here you all are. Every day I'm gifted the awesome challenge and privilege of making stuff, knowing that I have so much support from all corners of the world. Take care.